Hello, my name is Christian Maynard. It is likely that you know that if you've watched the previous videos in this podcast. If not, hello. I am currently completing my PhD in sociology at Washington State University, with an expected graduation date of May 2026. I study cannabis policy and adolescent use patterns in the United States, and as I neared completion of my dissertation, I wanted to share what I had learned in an immersive approach. The following video details the history of cannabis policy in the United States from colonial times to December 2025. I appreciate all the feedback, and if you leave a comment, I will get back to you and possibly feature your question in a future video. As for future work on this channel, I have a few ideas, but please stay tuned. Please like the video, comment something interesting, and let me know what you'd like to see next. Have a great day. Welcome to an episode of the Dazed and Confused podcast, where we explore the turbulent history of cannabis in the United States, from its criminalization to its medicalization and its reemergence as a legal commodity. Throughout the podcast, I examine cannabis policy as occurring through distinct eras.
And I was like, yeah, it's going to be called the Eras Tour. See you there.
Madness, war, medicalization, and legalization. We trace the arc of cannabis in America, from colonial hemp mandates to early pharmaceutical marvel, leading to the first legal threats that would eventually become full-blown panic. In 1619, settlers in Jamestown were mandated by law to grow cannabis, hemp to be precise. A brief note, hemp denotes cannabis plants that contain less than 0.3% concentration of THC, the chemical responsible for getting consumers high. This occurs naturally if male and female cannabis plants are not separated, as female plants are responsible for the buds that consumers use to get high. It was a requirement from King James I, meant to boost exports to England. In Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, hemp was so critical that it was even used as legal tinder. Founding fathers George Washington and Thomas Jefferson cultivated hemp on their plantations, using the labor of enslaved people. At one point, George Washington wrote in his diary about his apparent failure in separating the female and male cannabis plants.
Began to separate the male from the female hemp at dough. Rather too late.
Oh, hey, how you doing? Did Washington grow hemp? Yeah, Washington grew hemp. It's one of the many agricultural crops that he planted here at Mount Vernon on his 5 farms.
By the 1800s, cannabis had taken on a new meaning as medicine. Dr. William O'Shaughnessy Brooke reported on a wide range of medical applications. Pharmaceutical companies began marketing cannabis as remedies across the U.S. These pharmaceuticals were predominantly imported from India and sometimes Madagascar. Hash candy was advertised in papers like the Chicago Daily Tribune, which advocated that every household have some, on account of its harmlessness and potency, and that no clergyman, actor, singer, lawyer, or in fact anyone should be without it. But as the US entered the late 1800s, attitudes shifted. The aftermath of the Opium Wars generated anti-intoxicant sentiment. Public concern grew over the products that were tainted or contained certain substances. In 1880, California legislator Anderson Walker tried to outlaw hemp alongside opium. His bill failed. Why? Lawmakers were more focused on the influx of opium. Cannabis wasn't yet the villain. In an 1895 San Francisco Call article entitled Local Hashish Eaters, the author referred to hashish as the opium of Arabia. In 1906, the Theodore Roosevelt administration passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. This was the first federal regulation to address labeling for dangerous substances, including cannabis. However, Harvey Washington Wiley, inaugural U.S. Commissioner of the Food and Drugs Administration, prioritized harms related to additives in foods rather than drugs. Yet again, cannabis was not the focus. Dr. Hamilton Wright, the U.S. first opium commissioner, pushed for its inclusion in the narcotics bill. He wrote,
"I would not be at all surprised if, when we get rid of the opium danger, the chloral peril, and the other now known drug evils, we shall encounter new one. Hashish, of which we know very little in this country, will doubtless be adopted by many of the unfortunates if they can get it.
Things changed at the state level. Massachusetts led the way in 1911, prohibiting cannabis without prescription. California followed with its poison laws in 1913. By the 1920s, states from New York to Texas to Oregon began enacting bans. In one of the first raids, California Inspector Roy Jones seized a wagon load of dreams from what newspapers dubbed dream gardens. These gardens held around $15,000 in today's dollars worth of cannabis. The New York Boylan's Act didn't just limit prescriptions. It banned doctors and dentists addicted to habit-forming drugs from practicing medicine. By the 1920s, cannabis had shifted from a medicinal herb and agricultural staple to a controlled substance in nearly a dozen states. But the fear was just getting started. Around the 1920s, cannabis became the subject of moral panic, fueled by sensationalist media reports and amplified by key public figures. It started with the press. William Randall Hearst, media magnate and paper mill owner, had a vested interest in suppressing hemp, a potential competitor to wood-based paper. His papers published stories of cannabis craze incidents. One San Francisco Examiner article warned,
"Hashish will turn the mildest man in the world into a bloodthirsty murderer. The man who takes hashish runs amok with his bloody knife in one hand and his strangling cloth in the other. And he kills until the hashish has burnt out its deadly flame. Heroin is almost as bad."
These stories, salacious and unverified, formed the basis for public hysteria. This was yellow journalism at its most destructive. Harry Anslinger, head of the newly formed Federal Bureau of Narcotics, appointed under Hoover, took these headlines and turned them into policy. Describing the 1930s within his 1961 book, The Murderers, Anslinger recalled,
"A gang of boys tear the clothes from two schoolgirls and deride the screaming girls, one boy after the other. A 16-year-old kills his entire family of 5 in Florida. A man in Minnesota puts a bullet through the head of a stranger on the road. In Colorado, husband tries to shoot his wife, kills her grandmother instead, and then kills himself. Every one of these crimes had been preceded by the smoking of one or more marijuana reefers."
Anslinger's rhetoric wasn't just alarmist. It was explicitly racist. He infamously claimed that cannabis made
"Reefer makes think they're as good as white men.
as well as
White women to seek sexual relations with Negroes, entertainers, and any others."
in his later years, he believed that drug addiction was contagious. Goth, a eugenicist and nativist, echoed the anti-immigrant sentiment, asserting that
Mexican peddlers have been caught distributing sample marijuana cigarettes to school children.
in 1937, 30 states prohibited the use of cannabis without a prescription. The Roosevelt administration
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
passed the Marijuana Tax Act. Though not an outright ban, the law made cannabis prohibitively difficult to access. A $100 per ounce tax was imposed on unregistered users. This is the equivalent to $2,000 in 2023. At the same time, propaganda films like Reefer Madness, Marijuana, and Assassin of the Youth hit theaters. As part of the marketing materials for Assassin of the Youth, matchbooks were created and distributed. These films depicted individuals spiraling into murder, madness, and moral collapse, all because of cannabis.
I know what you want. You want to kill me. You're crazy. Take it easy, kid. I just want to talk to you.
Oh, I didn't see you there. You're listening to the Dazed and Confused podcast, so don't just sit there dazed. Smash that like button, get subscribed, and scream something dumb in the comments like legalize pigeons.
Absolutely keep a hummingbird as a pet, bro. It's no different than having a parrot or a parakeet. It's a bird, bro.
You really can't? And I'm not saying I agree with it. It's just that bird law in this country, it's not governed by reason.
Not everyone bought into the hype. In 1940, New York Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia commissioned a scientific study. As part of the LaGuardia Commission, 6 police officers, nicknamed the Marijuana Squad, familiarize themselves with cannabis to become experts at detection in various social gatherings and contexts. Investigators examined sexual eroticism with visits to dance clubs and brothels, noting no difference in suggestive dancing like the jitterbug between users and non-users. Its conclusions? Quote, marijuana is not an important factor in the development of delinquency. This report also debunked the gateway drug mythos, the concept that cannabis leads to harder drugs. In 1953, sociologist Howard Becker published Becoming a Marijuana User, a study arguing that cannabis use is a social learning process, not an automatic descent into deviance. Some consumers have reported not knowing or feeling high during initial experimentation. Instead, they must learn to associate different effects with the drug: hunger, panic, loss of time, tranquility, energy, and so on. Over time, with repeated frequency, an individual embeds the association of cannabis with pleasurable sensations. Through the 50s and 60s, cannabis policy became harsher, not softer. Mandatory sentencing, longer prison sentences, and crackdowns all fall. As cannabis slipped further into the shadows of criminal law, federal policy tightened its grip. Under President Truman, the 1951 Boggs Act made incarceration mandatory for cannabis possession. No judicial discretion. A first-time offense could land someone in prison for up to 5 years, with fines equivalent to more than $25,000 in today's money. President Eisenhower followed suit. His 1956 Narcotic Control Act hiked the maximum sentence to 10 years, with fines reaching what today would be over $200,000. The message from the federal government was clear: cannabis was a threat. State lawmakers, especially in places like California, embraced this panic. By 1954, possessing cannabis could earn someone a decade behind bars. The judicial system took notice. In the 1969 case of Leary v. United States, the Supreme Court ruled that the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act violated individuals' Fifth Amendment rights, as it compelled individuals to self-incriminate in order to pay the associated tax. Leary, along with 4 others, had traveled from New York to Mexico. After being denied entry into Mexico, Leary returned to Texas, where he was searched and found in possession of cannabis, a violation of the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act. Timothy Leary, a Washington State University graduate and former clinical psychologist at Harvard University, had been one of the most prominent researchers on drugs, specifically psychedelics, of the time. Leary, who famously stated,
"Turn on, tune in, and drop out."
Some claim that Nixon had declared Leary the most dangerous man in America, but this claim has been disputed. But that ruling, Leary v. United States, marked a turning point. After more than 3 decades, the federal government's first major cannabis law had been struck down. A new era was coming, and it would be anything but peaceful. The era of war.
And I was like, yeah, it's going to be called the Eras Tour. See you there.
This was a domestic crusade that reshaped cannabis policy, rewrote public perceptions, and targeted a new generation of Americans.
Leading medical researchers are coming to the conclusion that marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug in the United States, and we haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects.
That was Ronald Reagan on the campaign trail in 1980. But the story of cannabis prohibition during this period begins much earlier, under Nixon. Let's rewind. The 1960s and 70s were years of upheaval. Millions of young people took to the streets, protesting the Vietnam War.
To the pickup zone. Just a peaceful walk in the sun.
My fellow Americans, as President and Commander-in-Chief, to report
that all men are created equal.
Baby boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, were coming of age and weren't quiet about it. During the 1968 presidential campaign, and later completed in 1973, Nixon promised to end conscription, the draft.
At 12:30 Paris time today, January 23, 1973, The agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam was initialed by Dr. Henry Kissinger on behalf of the United States.
He favored a volunteer-based army on the belief that the anti-war movement would be weakened if middle-class youth knew that they were not going to war. You've probably heard the chant, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote." That wasn't just a slogan, it became a constitutional reality with the ratification of the 26th Amendment in 1971, lowering the voting age to 18.
The reason the voting age should be lowered is not that 18-year-olds are old enough to fight, it is because they are smart enough to vote.
In a 1968 speech entitled Today's Youth, the Great Generation, Nixon called for
an expanded democracy
and suggested
present leadership has failed young America.
President Nixon courted the youth vote publicly, but privately, he played a different game.
In studying the New York Times release of the Gallup poll on youth, one lesson comes through loud and clear. It is imperative that we limit our registration wherever possible without announcing that that is our tactic to the non-college youth.
Nixon's strategy was clear: suppress the youth vote, harness conservative youth, and appear inclusive while being anything but. Meanwhile, cultural tensions around cannabis were bubbling. In 1972, then-Governor Ronald Reagan ranted in his diary after watching the movie 9 to 5 that he was angry at a scene where women got high instead of drunk. He called it, quote,
"Slept in, took a morning walk, then spent the afternoon with desk work. We had both sneaked out and bought Valentines for each other, and believe it or not, we did surprise each other. Ran a movie and had Dan Rugg and the others who have to go with us over for it. It was a comedy, Jane Fonda, Dolly Parton, and Lily Tomlin, 9 to 5. Funny, but one scene made me mad. A truly funny scene if the three gals had played getting drunk, but no, they had to get stoned on pot. It was an endorsement of pot smoking for any young person who sees the picture."
This is really good pot. What did you say it was called again? Maui Wowie. Well, I love it. It's primo.
In 1969, Nixon initiated Operation Intercept. For 3 weeks, U.S. border agents virtually shut down crossings from Mexico, hoping to choke the cannabis supply. Traffic jams stretched for hours, business leaders fumed, and diplomatic tensions soured. Individuals claimed that they had to resort to using harder drugs because, quote, there was no grass around. One federal official remarked,
"We're measuring our success not by the quantity of seizures made, but by the price of marijuana, heroin, and other drugs on the market. It is raising their cost beyond the means of most young people in America."
Despite the frustrations caused by Operation Intercept, Nixon pressed on. In 1971, he declared,
"America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive."
In 1970, Nixon signed the Controlled Substance Act. Cannabis was criminalized and slotted into Schedule I, alongside heroin and LSD. This classification meant that cannabis had no medical value. Do you want to do this? Do you want to do the podcast cookie? This implied that cannabis had no medical value and a high potential for abuse. Unlike the Marijuana Tax Act, which applied a highly punitive tax to non-medical use, and alcohol prohibition, which prohibited manufacturing and trafficking, the CSA directly criminalized personal possession. As part of the Controlled Substance Act, a commission was established to study cannabis use outcomes. Nixon appointed Raymond Schaefer, Republican governor of Pennsylvania, to lead the investigation. However, nearly a year before the findings were published, Nixon publicly declared that even if the commission does recommend that cannabis be legalized, I will not follow that recommendation. In 1972, the 1,000-plus page Schaefer Commission report debunked several misconceptions, rejecting claims that cannabis was a gateway drug, or that it increased aggression, and suggested instead that cannabis might inhibit aggressive behavior. The commission ultimately recommended decriminalizing possession for personal use and small-scale distribution. In a private audio tape unearthed in 2023, recorded on March 6, 1973, Nixon acknowledged that cannabis, quote,
"Let me say, I know how you got it. I know that it's not particularly dangerous. I know most of the kids are legalized, but on the other hand, it's the wrong signal in this."
In the same tape,
I know should be an event, and there should not be these penalties that, Texas say they had contributors, or 10 years for penalties should be commensurate with the crime. I know that in the paper the other day, my father turned in his old and then after he said, I didn't realize the penalty was 30 years. I want to encourage the drug thing. We're starting to win the fight against drugs, to let down the bars, and to encourage the drug culture.
In a 2016 interview, John Erkelman, who served as Nixon's domestic policy chief, remarked,
"The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did."
After Nixon resigned because of his involvement in the Watergate scandal,
And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President Gerald Ford carried the torch. Abroad, he expanded U.S. involvement in controversial crop eradication programs in Mexico, spraying paraquat, a deadly herbicide, on cannabis fields, even though these crops were later sold to U.S. consumers. Although the administration claimed that Mexico directed and controlled the program, from 1973 to 1978, the U.S. provided approximately $40 million, primarily spent on American-made aircrafts, with DEA agents accompanying Mexican officials to ensure that the crops were adequately destroyed. Benjamin T. Smith, professor at the University of Warwick, examined actions taken by the DEA. U.S. personnel in Mexico had posed as potential buyers for drugs, with drug traffickers subjected to violent and lethal forms of punishment by both Mexican and U.S. officials. One U.S. agent recounted an event where a colleague had emptied a clip from a gun into a fleeing suspect until he was shot to pieces. In a 1975 grand jury testimony, an ex-agent remarked,
"Agents participated in the torture. Anybody, it didn't matter a shit who it was. They would actually participate in the torture of these goddamn people. I got caught up in a goddamn gunfight there myself and killed men. Now we were running into this kind of stuff constantly, all the time."
At home, even the Ford family wasn't immune to drug use. Jack Ford, the president's son, casually admitted to smoking pot. First Lady Betty Ford had struggled with alcohol and opiates abuse.
"I have found I am not only addicted to the medication I have been taking for my arthritis, but also to alcohol."
Still, Ford pressed on, calling drug abuse
a problem of deep personal concern to me, and one which requires a careful but forceful policy both at home and abroad.
But not everyone or every state went along with federal policy. The National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, NORML, which formed in 1970, led efforts to both reschedule cannabis at the federal level and decriminalize cannabis at the state level. In 1972, NORML submitted a petition to the DEA to either delist cannabis from the CSA, Controlled Substance Act, or reschedule the drug to Schedule 5. John Ingersoll, DEA director, rejected this petition, citing constraints from an international treaty, the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. This argument in favor of rejection was later dismissed, leading to a prolonged legal struggle over the classification of cannabis, discussed later. Because of advocacy efforts, several states deviated from the punitive regime by the advancement of policies like decriminalization, which eliminates incarceration as a potential punishment for the possession of small quantities of cannabis. Usually offenders are subjected to a fine similar to a traffic ticket. Oregon led the way in 1973. In Alaska, because of the 1975 case of Reagan v. State, the Alaska Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the state's constitutional right to privacy covered the possession of cannabis by adults at home for personal use.
The use of marijuana, as it is presently used in the United States today, does not constitute a public health problem of any significant dimensions. It is, for instance, far more innocuous in terms of physiological and social damage than alcohol or tobacco.
In California, after decriminalization, arrests halved, with enforcement expenditures dropping from $7.6 million down to $2.3 million. In Ohio, residents experienced a significant shift from having some of the strictest to some of the most lenient laws at the time. In Downey v. Prenny, 1975, the U.S. Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled that a sentence of 30 to 60 years for a first-time offender convicted for possession and sale of small quantities of cannabis was cruel and unusual punishment. During the 1970s, 420, a popular code word that was coined by 5 friends called the Waldos at San Rafael High School in California, which they used to signify the desire, and often the meeting times, to consume cannabis. 420 would become synonymous with subcultures associated with cannabis, stoners or cannabis enthusiasts. By the end of the 1970s, several states had decriminalized. Even throughout the era of war, with heavy-handed policies, a divergence had begun. A resistance was building in the courtrooms, legislatures, and advocacy groups. On the horizon, Jimmy Carter's presidency offered hopes of a ceasefire to the ongoing drug wars. This would not materialize.
Penalties against possession of a drug should not be more damaging to an individual than the use of the drug itself.
That was Jimmy Carter. Speaking to Congress in 1977, he was calling for the decriminalization of small amounts of cannabis, up to 1 ounce. It sounded like the beginning of a ceasefire in America's decades-long drug war. But by the end of his presidency, that ceasefire had collapsed. And what came next would be an all-out crusade during the era of war. Today, we're moving from Carter's short-lived push for reform to Reagan's full-throttle escalation of the war on drugs. We'll talk about paraquat poisoning, cannabis on the White House roof, the reemergence of medical marijuana, and how the 1980s brought the drug wars to the American classrooms. In 1977, Carter made a bold statement for the time.
I support legislation amending federal law to eliminate all federal criminal penalties for the possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana. This decriminalization is not legalization. It means only that the federal penalty for possession would be reduced and a person would receive a fine rather than a criminal penalty. Federal penalties for trafficking would remain in force and the states would remain free to adopt whatever laws they wish concerning the marijuana smoker.
He framed it carefully. No change to trafficking laws, no interference with state decisions, just a reduced penalty, a fine, not a criminal record. But Carter's administration faced a major controversy, not from Congress, but from south of the border, as discussed in the previous episode and revealed more during the Carter administration.
Agents participated in the torture. Anybody, it didn't matter a shit who it was. They would actually participate in the torture of these goddamn people. I got caught up in a goddamn gunfight there myself and killed men. Now we were running into this kind of stuff constantly, all the time.
The U.S. was helping Mexico spray paraquat, a toxic herbicide, on cannabis fields. Carter claimed,
American money is not used to purchase the paraquat.
And he said that he strongly supported the program. Meanwhile, at the White House, cannabis wasn't just a policy issue. In 1977, country star Willie Nelson and Chip Carter, the president's son, had smoked cannabis on the roof of the White House.
When I first met Jimmy, first thing he did was quote my songs back to me.
Bob Dylan has been one of my best friends, along with Willie Nelson. When Willie Nelson wrote his autobiography, he confessed that he smoked pot in the White House, and he says that his companion was one of the servants at the White House. Actually, was one of my sons.
Another son, Jack, had been dismissed from the Navy for cannabis use, and First Lady Rosalind Carter confirmed that yet another son, Jeff, had also tried it, while Carter struggled to move federal law. A legal battle reintroduced cannabis as medicine. In U.S. v. Randall, 1976, Robert Randall, a glaucoma patient facing blindness, convinced the courts that cannabis was the only effective treatment for his condition.
The defendant's interest in retaining his sight outweighs the government's interest.
As a result of this lawsuit, by 1979, Carter had created the Compassionate Investigational New Drug Program, allowing the University of Mississippi to grow and supply cannabis to select patients. Randall himself reportedly smoked up to 70 joints a week to control for eye pressure. He also helped other patients qualify for the program. But the program was small. Only about 30 people ever qualified, and patients routinely said that the government's cannabis was low quality compared to the streets. Individuals would receive a tin shown here. A couple of states also took some actions. New Mexico launched a limited medical research program in 1978. Virginia allowed doctors to recommend cannabis for cancer and glaucoma in 1979. Then came 1981 and a new president.
Leading medical researchers are coming to the conclusion that marijuana, pot, grass, whatever you want to call it, is probably the most dangerous drug in the United States, and we haven't begun to find out all of the ill effects, but they are permanent ill effects.
Reagan offered no evidence but claimed he had
absolute proof that smoking even one marijuana cigarette is equal in brain damage to being on Bikini Island during an H-bomb blast.
From the start, his administration expanded eradication efforts. By 1983, the DEA and California authorities had launched CAMP, the Campaign Against Marijuana Planting, targeting Northern California's Emerald Triangle. Residents complained about helicopters buzzing, with one report of a horse being spooked to death. By 1985, 50 states were part of the federal eradication program. By 1985, all states were part of this program. Reagan's war on drugs wasn't just fought in fields and courtrooms, it entered American schools. In Los Angeles, police and educators created DARE, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, in 1983, later renamed in 2009 to the Keeping It Real program. It taught kids from preschool to high school about the dangers of drugs, with officers as guest lecturers. One brief interruption. I personally know someone who rolled up their DARE program certificate into a joint and smoked it. Don't smoke paper. It's not healthy. In 1986, Congress gave DARE federal funding, and soon 3/4 of U.S. school districts were on board. In 1986, Nancy and Ronald Reagan addressed the nation, claiming,
"With us working together as a nation united, now we need your support again. Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children. And by next year, our spending for drug law enforcement will have more than tripled from its 1981 levels. We have increased seizures of illegal drugs. Shortages of marijuana are now being reported."
First Lady Nancy Reagan toured the country with her Just Say No campaign, telling kids that they had the power to resist drugs. By 1988, over 12,000 Just Say No clubs existed.
For the sake of our children, I implore each of you to be unyielding and inflexible in your opposition to drugs. Our young people are helping us lead the way. Not long ago in Oakland, California, I was asked by a group of children what to do if they were offered drugs. And I answered, just say no. Soon after that, those children in Oakland formed a Just Say No club. And now there are over 10,000 such clubs all over the country. Well, their participation and their courage in saying no needs our encouragement. We can help by using every opportunity to force the issue of not using drugs to the point of making others uncomfortable, even if it meaning making ourselves unpopular. Our job is never easy because drug criminals are ingenious. They work every day to plot a new and better way to steal our children's lives.
Oh, hello there. I didn't see you. I was just teaching Mr. Cookie how to fly. If you're enjoying the Dazed and Confused podcast, you can keep it going for just $4.20 a month on Patreon. It keeps the research flying, and it helps me afford his millet. Meanwhile, Reagan's 1984 Comprehensive Crime Control Act gave local police and federal agencies the right to keep properties seized in drug cases, from cars to cash, creating a powerful incentive to focus on drug arrests. In 1989, Attorney General Richard Thornburgh remarked,
"It's now possible for a drug dealer to serve time in a forfeiture-financed prison after being arrested by agents driving a forfeiture-provided automobile while working in a forfeiture-funded sting operation."
Reagan also nominated Douglas Ginsburg to the Supreme Court, but Ginsburg admitted to trying cannabis on several occasions throughout the 60s and 70s, clarifying,
"Marijuana was the only drug I ever used. I have not used it since. It was a mistake and I regret it."
Following public controversy, his nomination was withdrawn. Remember NORML's petition to delist or reschedule cannabis discussed in the previous episode? In 1988, DEA Judge Francis Young concluded that cannabis was
marijuana, in its natural form, is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. It would be unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious for DEA to continue to stand between those sufferers and the benefits of this substance.
And he urged that be made available to patients. However, DEA Administrator John Law rejected the recommendation, accusing Young of ignoring credible scientific evidence.
Young ignored the scientific evidence, ignored the testimony of highly credible and recognized medical experts, and instead relied on the testimony of psychiatrists and individuals who used marijuana.
And yet, outside of Washington, some surprising voices called for the legalization of all drugs. In 1990, real estate developer Donald Trump voiced support.
"We're losing badly the war on drugs. You have to legalize drugs to win that war. You have to take the profit away from these drug czars."
Reagan's war on drugs marked an escalation, with his predecessor George H.W. Bush maintaining many of those punitive cannabis policies. In 1989, Bush appointed William Bennett as the first director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. So what was Bennett's take on cannabis?
"Why in God's name foster the use of a drug that makes you stupid?"
That year, the administration launched Operation Green Merchant, targeting specialty gardening stores. Federal agents collected customer records, then raided homes based on the purchases of legal equipment. Over 400 people were arrested as part of these raids. In 1990, Congress passed the Solomon-Luttenberg Amendment, better known as the Smoke a Joint, Lose Your License law. States had a choice: suspend driver's licenses for drug offenses, even if the individual did not own or operate a vehicle at the time of the drug offense, or states faced the possibility of losing federal highway funds. By 1994, 19 states had adopted the suspension policy. Now 3. Bush also restricted the federal investigational new drug program, which allowed a small number of patients to legally use medical cannabis. Amid a surge of applications, especially from people living with AIDS, the administration stopped accepting new participants.
If the Public Health Service is going around giving marijuana to folks, there would be a perception that this stuff can't be so bad.
Cannabis use as a political litmus test showed signs of weakening when Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas.
I would like to start by saying unequivocally, uncategorically, that I deny each and every single allegation against me today. And from my standpoint, as a Black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching.
Admitted he'd use cannabis in college and perhaps once in law school. The administration dismissed it as non-consequential, along with many other scandals.
His conversations were very vivid. He spoke about acts that he had seen in pornographic films involving such matters as women having sex with animals and films showing group sex or rape scenes. He talked about pornographic materials depicting individuals with large penises or large breasts involved in various sex acts. On several occasions, Thomas told me graphically of his own sexual prowess. Because I was extremely uncomfortable talking about sex with him at all, and particularly in such a graphic way, I told him that I did not want to talk about these subjects.
Officials acknowledged that rejecting nominees based on their past use could, in their words, disqualify a whole generation. Jimmy Carter's presidency showed a brief opening for cannabis reform, but Reagan's tenure resulted in a setback for the pro-legalization movement. By the early 90s, the anti-cannabis machinery expanded on by Reagan was firmly entrenched. Asset forfeiture, DARE, Just Say No, these weren't just laws, they were cultural campaigns, especially aimed at the youth, and they kept cannabis criminalization and its stigma deeply woven in American life. In our next episode, we'll shift from politics to the research front, exploring the major studies on cannabis that emerged throughout the era of war and what they revealed about the plant and its place in American society. Cannabis use and public attitudes evolved in parallel during the era of war, a period defined by its aggressive legislation and intense enforcement, especially aimed at adolescents. Yet, research from this time tells a complicated story, revealing mixed results. To understand those patterns, we'll look at national surveys that tracked adolescent attitudes and behaviors towards cannabis, public opinion on legalization, and arrests. In 1981, researchers from Monitoring the Future, MTF, released a report that directly addressed the big policy question: did decriminalization increase youth cannabis use? They found no evidence to support that claim. In fact, in early change states like California, Maine, Ohio, and Minnesota, the prevalence of use dropped by nearly 3% over 5 years, with no meaningful change in how often adolescents use it. The report was blunt. There was absolutely no evidence that decriminalization increased the proportion of youth who had ever tried cannabis. Arrest rates provided by official sources such as the Uniform Crime Report, UCR, indicated a different kind of story. By the mid-1970s, cannabis-related arrests per 100,000 people had surged to around 200, before declining to about 130 in the early 1990s. Public opinion during this time leaned heavily against legalization. In 1969, Gallup found only 12% of Americans supported making cannabis legal. By 1985, support had grown, but only to about 23%. Three major surveys shaped what we know about adolescents during this time: the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, NSDUH, Monitoring the Future, MTF, and the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, YRBS. Each used different sampling and collection methods, giving us multiple perspectives on youth trends. The NSDUH began in 1971 as the National Household Survey on Drug Abuse. It used in-home, face-to-face interviews, excluding active duty military, incarcerated people, and those without shelter. In 1974, 19% of 12 to 17-year-olds had reported using cannabis in the previous year. By 1992, that figure had dropped to 8%. MTF, which launched in 1975, surveyed high school seniors and later 8th and 10th graders inside of classrooms. From 1975 to 1980, roughly half of 12th graders had reported that they used cannabis in the previous year. By 1992, only 22% reported this. Notice the difference in use prevalence depending on the location at which you survey adolescents. MTF also tracked attitudes and access. The percentage of 12th graders who saw great risk in regular cannabis use climbed from 40% during the Ford administration to 75% in 1992. And when it came to access, that barely changed. From 1976 to 1995, around 89% of seniors said cannabis was fairly or very easy to get, regardless of federal crackdowns. This is a pattern that will be repeated in following eras. The YRBS, first run in 1991, focused on past month and lifetime use. In its debut year, it found that 18% of high school students had used cannabis in the last 30 days, and 41% had used it at any point in their lifetime. The takeaway: as policymakers poured resources into punitive laws and enforcement, surveys showed cannabis use, especially among teens, decreased. Adolescents increasingly viewed cannabis use as a great risk, with few changes in reported availability. That wraps up our major exploration of the major research studies conducted during the era of war. Next time, we'll enter the era of medicalization, starting with the Clinton administration, when medical cannabis emerged as a flashpoint in national debates, signaling the first major cracks in the prohibitionist consensus.
Presidential primary only 8 days away, Bill Clinton stepped smack dab into the middle of another controversy, and he did it right here at Channel 2 during a live appearance with Jerry Brown on Sunday Edition. Clinton, who at times has been referred to by the nickname Slick Willie, admitted for the first time anywhere that he had used drugs.
When I was in England, I experimented with marijuana a time or two, and I didn't like it, and didn't inhale, and never tried it again.
That infamous line from Bill Clinton in 1992, it became a punchline across late-night television, a way to mock the hypocrisy of politicians who had tried cannabis, but still stood firmly against legalization. But beyond the joke, Clinton's presidency marked a turning point in America's cannabis story. While federal policy remained against cannabis, several states began legalizing cannabis for medical purposes. During the 1990s, states began taking cannabis policy into their own hands. California was first, with Proposition 215 in 1996, the Compassionate Use Act. This wasn't a top-down reform. It was driven by patients, activists, and local collectives like the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club. That club had supplied cannabis to people with HIV or AIDS. But in 1996, federal agents raided and seized over 40 pounds of cannabis. For patients, that raid was devastating and galvanizing. Dennis Perone, a club founder, helped spearhead Prop 215. When the initiative passed, Perone lit up a pipe and declared, "Isn't democracy great?" In a lesser-known ballot measure, Arizona voters passed Proposition 200, which legalized the medical use of cannabis, along with other substances on Schedule 1, like heroin and LSD. Specifically, after receiving an endorsement from 2 physicians, including citations of relevant scientific research, an individual could obtain a prescription, which is an order to dispense a medication. Before taking effect, policymakers with Republican Governor Fifi Symington's support neutralized many of the provisions by passing legislation requiring that the Food and Drug Administration approve any substance relevant to Proposition 200 before a prescription was filled. One of the co-sponsors of the neutralization bill, Republican Senator John Cates, argued that voters
weren't entirely sure what they were voting on. Proposition 200 was a medical heroin bill.
Other states soon followed: Alaska, Oregon, Washington, Maine, Colorado, Hawaii, and Nevada. By the end of Clinton's presidency, 8 states had legalized medical cannabis, all through ballot initiatives put directly to the voters. DC's legalization measure faced the most significant hurdle of all the medical cannabis initiatives. Preemptively, House Representative Robert Barr included an amendment in DC's appropriations which prohibited federal funds for costs associated with ballot initiatives that lessen penalties for cannabis, including counting and reporting the results. Subsequently, DC voters were initially unaware that Initiative 59 had passed by 69%. John M. Farron, DC's Corporation Counsel, offered to pay the whopping costs for tabulating the results, about $1.64. The ACLU filed a Freedom of Information request along with a lawsuit to have the results made public. The following year, 1999, Judge Richard W. Roberts issued a ruling allowing DC officials to count the vote. However, the Republican-controlled Congress enacted restrictions against the implementation of medical legalization. These restrictions would remain in place until 2009. The Clinton administration did not embrace this shift. Officially, federal law had not changed. Cannabis remained illegal under the Controlled Substance Act. Clinton proposed extreme measures, including drug testing every teenager before they can get their driver's license.
We should use the privilege of a driver's license to demand responsibility when it comes to drugs by insisting that teens pass a drug test as a condition of getting a driver's license. Let's send a simple message to our children, our families, and our friends. Driving under the influence of drug or alcohol is wrong, it's illegal, it can kill.
And his administration poured $175 million into anti-drug ads, mostly targeted at adolescents.
This is your brain, and this is heroin. This is what happens to your brain after snorting heroin. And this is what your body goes through. Wait, it's not over yet. This is what your family goes through. And your friends and mine. And your job future. Any questions?
His officials stuck to this approach. Health Secretary Donna Shalala said,
"All available research has concluded that marijuana is dangerous to our health. Marijuana harms the brain, heart, lungs, and immune system."
Thomas A. Constantine, head of the DEA, also critiqued these initiatives to legalize cannabis for medical purposes, suggesting that the more than 6 million voters in California and Arizona were tricked by a sophisticated and misleading campaign into thinking that these initiatives provided compassionate pain relief. Oh, hello there. I didn't see you. I was just teaching Mr. Cookie how to fly. If you're enjoying the Dazed and Confused podcast, you can keep it going for just $4.20 a month on Patreon. It keeps the research flying, and it helps me afford his millet. The administration even threatened doctors who recommended cannabis to patients, saying that they would lose their ability to prescribe controlled substances or even face prosecution. That triggered lawsuits from doctors and patients, and eventually the White House would back off, allowing physicians to recommend cannabis to patients without punishment. Researchers at the Institute of Medicine released a landmark report in 1999. Their conclusions? Cannabis wasn't a gateway drug. Supplying medical cannabis did not result in an increase in cannabis use among the general population. They did express uncertainty about certain uses for cannabis, like for glaucoma, but urged the federal government to fund more studies and to stop obstructing state-level reforms. Still, stigma lingered not only around cannabis, but smoking itself. The 1990s were the height of the anti-tobacco movement, culminating in the $200 billion tobacco settlement in 1998. In that climate, the idea of smoking cannabis, or anything, as medicine struck many officials as backwards, even dangerous. Drug czar Barry McAfee supported cannabis pills or patches for medical patients while opposing giving a joint or a bong to terminally ill patients, claiming smoked marijuana isn't medicine. Congress also weighed in. In 1998, the House overwhelmingly passed a resolution opposing state medical cannabis initiatives, insisting that drugs had to go through the FDA approval process. In 1999, because of the popular support for cannabis for medical purposes, the House of Representatives convened a subcommittee entitled Pro and Cons of Drug Legalization, Decriminalization, and Harm Reduction. Representative Mark Souder of Indiana went as far as to say,
"I am one who is not particularly happy that we are having a hearing called the Pros and Cons of Drug Legalization. We do not have hearings called the Pros and Cons of Rape. We do not have hearings called the Pros and Cons of Child Abuse. We do not have hearings called the Pros and Cons of Racism. We do not have hearings called the Pros and Cons of Gangs. Those who advocate for the legalization of marijuana are responsible for blood in my district, in my neighborhood, families, and my community."
Despite the opposition from federal officials, individuals from key organizations offered support for cannabis reform. Eric Glassner, director of the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, reflected on his background as a parent, stating,
"When my 15-year-old said, 'I'm smoking marijuana, what should I do about it?' I talked to him as I would have if he told me he was drinking beer. And then I told him, you have 2 additional dangers from marijuana that you don't have from beer. One of them is you can get arrested for it. And the other is you don't know what you're getting on the street because it's totally unregulated. Frankly, I don't need the government's help in raising my children, and I don't want the government's intervention, particularly with the police power of the state. There are 70 million people, most of them adults, in this country who have admitted to using marijuana, and virtually all of them have done so while maintaining productive and stable lives."
David Bose, executive vice president of the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank formerly called the Charles Koch Foundation, detailed a story of Will Foster.
Foster used marijuana to control the pain and swelling associated with his crippling rheumatoid arthritis. He was arrested, convicted of marijuana cultivation, and sentenced to 93 years in prison, later generously reduced to 20 years in prison. Are his 3 children better off with a father who uses marijuana medicinally or a father in jail for 20 years?
And yet, the public tide on cannabis was shifting. Voters in Oregon, Washington, Nevada, and elsewhere kept approving medical cannabis, even when legislators tried to block it or water down the measures. By 2000, polls showed 34% of Americans supported legalization, up from 10% at the start of Clinton's presidency. While the country was awaiting the election results that eventually declared President George Bush the winner, Clinton told the Rolling Stone,
"I think that most small amounts of marijuana have been decriminalized in some places and should be."
So, while Clinton himself kept cannabis at a distance and his administration maintained federal prohibition, the 1990s marked a turning point for medical cannabis as it gained legitimacy through state ballot initiatives. Patients and advocates reframed cannabis as a medical commodity, challenging long-standing federal narratives of danger and deviance. By the end of Clinton's presidency, states had established legal protections for medical patients. Public support had increased, and the national conversation on cannabis had fundamentally shifted. These developments set the stage of the early 2000s when the Bush administration confronted this new policy landscape with a renewed commitment to federal enforcement and resistance to state-level reforms. Today we turn to his successor, George W. Bush.
We must stop the terror. I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Who not only inherited Clinton's policies and approach, but also expanded it. This episode traces federal resistance to medical cannabis in the 2000s, and how despite that resistance, the movement continued to grow at the state level. And will carry the story forward into the early Obama years, where a dramatic shift occurred in the tone and direction of federal enforcement. George W. Bush's presidency opened with a clear continuation of federal hostility towards medical cannabis. Just months into his first term, federal agents and prosecutors targeted medical cannabis operations in states where they were legal, from dispensaries to cannabis clubs to cultivation sites. One of the most prominent cases was that of Ed Rosenthal, a California grower who cultivated cannabis for seriously ill patients. Despite acting under state law, Rosenthal was convicted on federal charges. His sentence? Just 1 day in jail and a $1,000 fine. Here I show a clip of Ed Rosenthal smoking cannabis.
Okay, here we go. You know what this is? A portable hazardous waste incinerator that I carry with me a lot. Okay, here we go. We're going to incinerate some hazardous waste so that the police don't have to deal with it. Yep, that's what pot will do to you. That's what it will do. So you better watch out and only smoke hash.
But the trial highlighted the federal government's unwillingness to accept state-level medical programs. The Bush administration also fought in courts to protect federal power. They appealed a ruling in court that barred federal agents from investigating or prosecuting doctors who recommended cannabis to their patients. And yet, Bush himself was no stranger to cannabis. In a private audio recording later released to the public, he admitted his past use, though he quickly added,
I wouldn't answer the marijuana question. You know why? Because I don't want some little kid doing what I tried. But you got to understand, I want to be president. I want to lead. Do you want your little kid say, hey daddy, President Bush tried marijuana, I think I will?
Despite this acknowledgement, Bush firmly opposed legalization, and during his presidency, public opinion barely budged. About 1/3 of Americans supported legalization. But while the federal government resisted, the states kept moving. In Oregon, the medical program faced early criticism for its administrative mismanagement. The head of the Department of Human Services admitted the state had fallen short in implementing what voters had approved. By 2005, Montana voters passed their own medical initiative, though challenges and restrictions followed. That same year, Vermont's legislature legalized medical cannabis, despite Bush administration officials lobbying the governor to veto the bill. Rhode Island followed in 2005, overcoming a governor veto. In 2007, New Mexico's governor, Bill Richardson, became the first state executive to personally sign a medical cannabis bill into law. And in 2008, Michigan voters approved medical use by ballot, becoming the 13th state to do so. So even as the Bush administration escalated federal crackdowns, the state-level momentum was undeniable. The 2008 presidential election marked a turning point. Cannabis policy wasn't a central issue. The economy and foreign wars dominated the headlines, but the raids on state medical cannabis programs revealed a divide between the candidates. John McCain supported the continuation of federal raids, dismissing claims that terminally ill patients were being arrested.
As president, what are you going to do to stop an absolutely out of control and overfunded federal government from raiding state medical marijuana license facilities and clinics in 19 states who have decided that they support the right for a sick or dying or ill person to use medicine that will help?
Nothing. I don't believe that medical marijuana is necessary for the relief of pain. I don't believe it's healthy, and I don't believe that I believe that it is a national issue and not a statewide issue.
Whereas Barack Obama promised to end them.
Good to see you,
Pleasure
sir.
to meet you.
What's your name?
Scott Turner.
Scott, thank you so much.
I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
In the states where medical marijuana is legal,
yes,
and if New Hampshire, if it's legal here,
yeah,
I would be somebody who would benefit greatly from
right.
it. What would you be doing to stop the federal government from putting me in prison for using something that's legal here in New Hampshire?
I would not have the justice prosecuting medical marijuana. It's not a good use of our resources.
That's terrific. Thank you.
Obama's personal history with cannabis was far more open than his predecessors. Obama openly acknowledged his past experience with cannabis. In his 1979 high school yearbook, Obama wrote, "Thanks, Tut, his grandmother, Gramps, his grandfather, Coom, slang for smoking marijuana, gang, and Ray, the individual who sold to Obama for all the good times." In his 1995 memoir, Dreams of My Father, Obama also remarked on various experiences with cannabis and cocaine. In 2004, then state senator of Illinois, Obama expressed support for cannabis decriminalization.
In terms of legalization of drugs, I think that the battle, the war on drugs has been an utter failure, and I think that we need to rethink and decriminalize our marijuana laws. But I'm not somebody who believes in legalization of marijuana. What I do believe is that we need to rethink how we are operating in the drug wars, and I think that currently we are not doing a good job.
In 2006, then Senator Obama remarked that
Obama.
Look, when I was a kid, I inhaled frequently. That was the point.
So what was that cameraman on?
In his memoir and public comments, Obama treated his cannabis use as honest, if imperfect, part of his youth. And once in office, Obama broke from the long-standing federal approach. His Justice Department reprioritized enforcement, instructing agents to cease raids on state-licensed medical operations and focus instead on illicit trafficking disguised as medical use. The move was framed as a matter of resource allocation, but also marked a ceasefire in the federal-state conflict over cannabis. Shown is a video of Obama discussing his YouTube town hall.
A live interview with YouTube has become an annual event for the president as he seeks to connect with a younger audience. That may help explain why each year the most popular viewer question by far has been on the legalization of marijuana, which the president said, once again, he opposes.
We don't spend as much time thinking about how do we shrink demand.
Oh, hello there. I didn't see you. I was just teaching Mr. Cookie how to fly. If you're enjoying the Dazed and Confused podcast, you can keep it going for just $4.20 a month on Patreon. It keeps the research flying, and it helps me afford his millet. Congress followed suit, lifting a long-standing restriction that had prevented Washington, D.C. from implementing its 1998 medical cannabis referendum. By 2010, the D.C. Council passed new legislation opening the door for doctors to recommend cannabis for serious illnesses. In D.C., the first medical dispensary opened up in 2013. Meanwhile, states like New Mexico and Montana refined their programs, often with restrictive measures, but regardless, showing that the landscape of cannabis policy was shifting away from absolute prohibition. NPR reporter Jeff Brady labeled New Mexico as the most restrictive of the medical use states at the time. Politicians insisted that the strict design prevented a backdoor way to legalize pot. By mid-year, the excess demand by the 2,000-plus registered patients, coupled with restraints in licensure of the then 11 licensed growers, resulted in a cannabis shortage. One grower, Lee Goodman, stated,
"Sometimes patients don't have enough, so they use cannabis when the health condition is really severe, which is not good. It's like seniors cutting down on their meds because they can't afford it."
Opposition to cannabis legalization continued. A conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, also responsible for Project 2025, published a report entitled Legalization Marijuana: Why Citizens Should Say No, which made several questionable claims. 1. Compared to alcohol, marijuana is far more likely to cause addiction. 2. Cannabis has no known general healthful properties, though it may have some palliative care. 3. In fact, compared to alcohol, marijuana is not safe. 4. Citizens also should not overlook what may be the greatest harms of marijuana legalization: increased addiction to and use of harder drugs, the gateway mythos. 5. There is no doubt that if marijuana were legalized, more people, including juveniles, would consume it. No direct evidence would be provided for this last claim. In fact, many of the research studies that have been published on legalization since then have found that adolescents are less likely to consume cannabis after legalization. The Bush years were defined by federal resistance to popular mobilization. The federal government clung to prohibition, but the states continued to experiment, legislate, and expand access to cannabis for medical purposes. By the end of Bush's second term, 13 states had passed medical laws, a remarkable shift considering that none had done so before 1996. Not just different rhetoric, but the first genuine federal retreat from direct conflict with state-level cannabis reform. This was a period when the federal government doubled down on enforcement. Arrests for possession of cannabis continued to climb, yet public opinion steadily shifted towards being in favor of legalization. At the same time, key national surveys tracked changing adolescent use, risk perceptions, and availability, giving us a window into how young people experience cannabis during the eras. Throughout the era of medicalization, the per 100,000 arrest rate for cannabis possession offenses climbed rapidly from 146 in 1993 to 212 in 2011. Notice the jump in arrests during the Clinton administration. That is the likely result of the 1994 crime bill, which included provisions like the 3 strikes law, a driver in mass incarceration, especially among the poorest in the country. Broader public opinion continued to support legalization throughout the era of medicalization. In 1995, 25% of respondents supported legalization. By 2011, 50% of respondents shared this belief. Throughout the era of medicalization, key surveys continued to track trends in adolescent usage. Each of these discussed surveys provide a representative sample of the U.S. adolescent population. In 1993, the NSDUH, which is the survey delivered at homes, reported that 10% of 12th graders had used cannabis in the past year. By 2011, 14% had used cannabis. In 1993, MTF, the survey delivered at schools, reported that 26% of 12th graders had used cannabis in the previous year. By 2011, 36% of students had affirmed this. Notice the difference in past year use based on the location that the survey was administered. MTF also tracked two key influential factors related to cannabis use among adolescents: perceived risk and availability. In 1993, 73% of 12th grade students reported that regular cannabis use was a great risk. However, by 2011, only 46% affirmed this position. As for availability, the percentage fluctuated slightly but generally hovered around 83%. In 1993, the YRBS, which is a school-based survey, reported that 41% of high school students had used cannabis in their lifetime, whereas 18% had reported using cannabis in the previous 30 days. By 2011, 49% of students indicated that they had used cannabis in their lifetime, with 28% reporting use in the previous 30 days. The overall trend indicates that adolescents consistently found cannabis accessible, regardless of federal policies, drug enforcement strategies, or potentially medical legalization. That wraps up our look at the era of medicalization, where public opinion shifted, adolescent surveys revealed changing patterns, and yet arrests for cannabis possession continued to rise. Now we turn to Obama's second term, a period that witnessed one of the most dramatic shifts in cannabis history: the transition from medical legalization to adult use legalization. Beginning in 2012, Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize recreational cannabis. Over the following years, more states followed suit. Research began to track outcomes, and federal enforcement quietly retreated. This period can best be described as tacit acceptance, where prohibition technically remained federal law, but enforcement priorities shifted, allowing states to experiment with new policies. The early 2010s were still marked by economic uncertainty. The housing crisis had shaken state budgets, and many policymakers were searching for new ways to generate revenue. In 2010, Harvard economist Jeffrey Miron published a report estimating that legalizing cannabis would save $13.7 billion in enforcement costs and generate another $6.4 billion in tax revenue. More than 300 economists, including Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, signed a petition urging the country to hold an open and honest debate on prohibition. For the first time, the economics of legalization were a mainstream talking point. Cannabis wasn't just framed as a cultural or a criminal justice issue, it was being debated as a fiscal opportunity. California, the pioneer of modern medical legalization, became the first state to seriously test recreational legalization at the ballot box with Proposition 19 in 2010. The measure was well funded, drawing millions from activist groups, philanthropists, cannabis entrepreneurs like Richard Lee, and billionaire George Soros also contributed heavily. But despite high expectations, Prop 19 failed. 53% of voters rejected this. Why? Many believe that the campaign's business-oriented framing hurt it. Opponents warned of big cannabis, echoing concerns about industries like big tobacco and big alcohol. Richard Lee, a cannabis entrepreneur and the largest contributor to Prop 19, had stated,
"I wanted to figure out the best way to promote the idea of a cannabis industry, instead of non-profit cooperatives, that is, a bunch of hippies, peace and love, sharing their bud together in a Coca-Cola commercial, to teach the world to sing. Cannabis legalization is like Budweiser and Jack Daniels. It's a business.
Even San Francisco's mayor, Gavin Newsom, and the city's district attorney, Kamala Harris, declined to support the measure. Still, activists like Ethan Nadelman of the Drug Policy Alliance called the campaign historic, arguing that it elevated and legitimized the discourse around marijuana policy like nothing ever before. Prop 19 set the stage of what would come just 2 years later. In November 2012, history was made. Voters in Colorado and Washington passed ballot initiatives legalizing cannabis for adult use. Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper famously quipped,
"Legalization is a complicated process, but we intend to follow through. That said, federal law still says marijuana is an illegal drug, so don't break out the Cheetos or Goldfish too quickly."
acknowledging both the monumental shift and the complicated road ahead. The Seattle Police Department released a humorous FAQ to answer common questions, joking that no, you couldn't get your confiscated weed back, and yes, the smell of cannabis alone was not grounds for vehicle searches. These were cultural moments that underscored the magnitude of the shift. For the first time since federal prohibition began, states had not just decriminalized or medicalized cannabis, they had fully legalized it for adults. So how did the Obama administration respond? Unlike prior administrations that sued states or aggressively intervened, Obama made it clear that federal authorities had bigger fish to fry.
Do you think that marijuana should be legalized?
I wouldn't go that far, but what I think is that at this point, Washington and Colorado, you've seen the voters speak on this issue. And as it is, the federal government has a lot to do when it comes to criminal prosecutions. It does not make sense from a prioritization point of view for us to focus on recreational drug users in a state that has already said that under state law that's legal.
This position was formalized in 2013 with the Cole Memo, which deprioritized federal prosecution of individuals involved in state-sanctioned cannabis activities. Federal raids focused on illicit activities. State experiments were allowed to proceed. Congress also played a role. In 2014, an amendment was passed prohibiting the Department of Justice from using funds to intervene in state medical cannabis laws. This was tacit acceptance. In practice, prohibition remained law, but the federal government largely stepped back. In 2013, former Congressman Patrick Kennedy and policy advisor Kevin Sabet co-founded Smart Approaches to Marijuana, better known as SAM. They positioned themselves as a centrist alternative to outright prohibition, but in practice, they recycled many familiar claims that cannabis increased crime, fueled social disorder, or endangered youth. Critics point to SAM's ties to pharmaceutical companies and its softer stance on prescription misuse compared to cannabis. Some have called SAM an agency of demonization. In a fantastical and dubious claim, Sabet had stated,
"There's a lot of money to be made if marijuana is legal. Not a lot of money to be made if it remains illegal."
Is there a need to even discuss the immense police budgets that occurred with mass incarceration? Sam has also warned of big marijuana, framing legalization as a corporate takeover that would mimic the excesses of big tobacco. In 2014, Alaska and the District of Columbia passed adult use measures. DC, however, faced congressional pushback that blocked regulated sales, leading to a quirky free weed economy, where buying a t-shirt or getting a motivational message could come with a free bag of cannabis. In Alaska, KTVA reporter during a live stream, Charlo Green, revealed her ownership of the Alaska Cannabis Club, stating,
"Now everything you heard is why I, the actual owner of the Alaska Cannabis Club, will be dedicating all of my energy toward fighting for freedom and fairness, which begins with legalizing marijuana here in Alaska. And as for this job, well, not that I have a choice, but fuck it, I quit."
All right, we apologize for that.
Before walking off camera, she discussed her experiences to promote legalization with several media outlets, including a video call with Snoop Dogg. Snoop had promised to perform a concert in Alaska contingent on whether adult use legalization occurred.
We're gonna figure it out like this. If we get y'all to vote yes on Proposition 2, Snoop Dogg is coming to Alaska to do a concert, a wellness retreat concert, and I'm bringing some of that California with me to celebrate, you feel me? In a real way. Are you kidding me? No, I'm too serious. I'm serious as a motherfucker right now. If they vote yes on that, I'm locking and loading. I'm coming out there and I'm doing a concert for y'all, wellness retreat. We're gonna do it together to say that we brought something to life.
A promise that appears unkept as of August 2025. So Snoop, you going to Alaska soon? By 2016, a new wave of states joined the list. California, Maine, Massachusetts, and Nevada all passed legalization measures. Meanwhile, states like Vermont pursued decriminalization. Even so, some efforts failed. Ohio voters rejected a legalization initiative in 2015, largely due to concerns over its investor-driven structure, but also this initiative employed a cannabis-themed mascot named Buddy, who can best be described as a superhero-like individual with a grinning cannabis nug as a face, similar to that of Joe Camel, a controversial mascot for the Camel cigarette brand, which was banned because of its appeal to children.
Behind the effort to legalize marijuana, introduced a campaign mascot called Buddy. Children's healthcare advocates hit the roof.
This is nothing short of a children's health epidemic that's facing us should this pass, so that's why we're concerned.
Nick Lashutka at the Ohio Children's Hospital Association says children will be at risk of consuming marijuana edibles if it's legalized. And he believes using a superhero mascot with a green marijuana bud for a head sends the wrong message.
Legalization wasn't without its problems. In Colorado, highly potent edibles created controversy after several accidental overconsumption, which resulted in events that led to, sadly, a tragic death of a 19-year-old, Levi Thumba. In response, lawmakers capped THC levels per product and required child-resistant packaging. Other challenges emerged. There were lawsuits from neighboring states, debates over cannabis use in the workplace, and persistent questions about public health and safety. Still, reports suggested that teen use remained stable. Arrests plummeted and state revenues increased, though cannabis taxes rarely accounted for more than 1% of state budgets. So what about some of the early findings of the era of legalization in terms of research? Bakuber and colleagues examined U.S. death certificate data from 1999 to 2010. Compared to prohibited states, medical use states experienced fewer than expected fatal opioid overdoses. This effect grew larger over consecutive years. The Cato Institute and Drug Policy Alliance issued reports on the outcomes of legalization. Teen use remained unchanged, arrests for cannabis plummeted, though racial disparities remain. Legalization had little association with traffic fatalities. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, made several recommendations for federal research on cannabis. One recommendation of the NIDA report centered on the lack of products available for testing, with those few provided mostly by University of Mississippi, compared to the full range of products available in the regulated market. These available products often are more highly concentrated. President Obama himself weighed in on cannabis more directly than his predecessors. He admitted to past use, telling teenagers in Chicago that he made bad choices, but hoped they could learn from his mistakes.
I made bad choices. I got high without always thinking about the harm that it could do. I didn't always take school as seriously as I should have. I made excuses. Sometimes I sold myself short.
At the White House Correspondents' Dinner, he even joked,
"The problem is that the media landscape is changing so rapidly. You can't keep up with it. I remember when BuzzFeed was just something I did in college around 2 a.m. It's true."
Obama was also serious. At the NAACP 2015 conference, alongside Bill Clinton, he pledged to address mass incarceration, recognizing that the 1994 crime bill had worsened disparities. During his presidency, Obama commuted the sentences of over 1,700 nonviolent drug offenders, the most in history. On his last day alone, He granted clemency to 330 individuals, framing it as America's tradition of second chances. By the end of Obama's presidency, public opinion had transformed. In 2016, Gallup reported that 60% of Americans supported legalization. This shift was reflected in party platforms. Republicans, according to the 2016 RNC platform, warned,
"The progress made over the last 3 decades against drug abuse is eroding, whether for cultural reasons or for lack of national leadership. In many jurisdictions, marijuana is virtually legalized despite its illegality under federal law."
While Democrats, according to their platform, stated,
"We encourage the federal government to remove marijuana from the list of Schedule I federal controlled substances and to appropriately regulate it, providing a reasoned pathway for future legalization. We believe that the states should be laboratories of democracy on the issue of marijuana, and those states that want to decriminalize it or provide access to medical marijuana should be able to do so. We support policies that will allow more research on marijuana, as well as reforming our laws to allow legal marijuana businesses to exist without uncertainty. And we recognize our current marijuana laws have had an unacceptable disparate impact in terms of arrest rates for African Americans that far outstrip arrest rates for whites, despite similar usage rates."
Cannabis began to serve as a current divide between the two major parties, along with many other things, despite the growing broad favorability. By the time Obama left office in 2017, cannabis policy had entered a new era.
And I was like, yeah, it's going to be called the Eras Tour. See you there.
Legalization was no longer a fringe idea. It was law in multiple states, supported by the majority of the public and quietly tolerated by the federal government. This period of tacit acceptance laid the groundwork of rapid expansion of legalization in the years to come, as new states, and eventually Congress itself, grappled with the question of what a post-prohibition future might look like. That wraps up our look at Obama's second term and the rise of adult use legalization and the actions taken by the Trump administration first term, and the continued refinement at the state level. Under the first Trump administration, federal cannabis policy displayed signals of changing in either direction. Despite Trump's apparent support for cannabis for medical purposes,
legalized marijuana is always a very difficult question for medicinal purposes, for medical purposes. Absolutely, it's fine.
He rarely talked about it, and in large part, federal cannabis policy remained unchanged. His appointments of cabinet officials and others in his social circle serve as valuable insight into his administration's approach, its actions and inactions. His appointment of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General raised alarm. Reports resurfaced about an incident during the 1980s when, as U.S. Attorney for Mobile, Alabama, Sessions remarked on a case involving the slaying of a black man by the KKK, stating that he thought the KKK were
okay until I found out they smoked pot.
Sessions also stated,
recreational is a bike ride, a swim, going to the beach. Using a drug to put your brain in an altered state is not recreation. That is self-destructive behavior and escapism.
As part of his actions, Sessions created the Justice Department's Task Force on Crime Reduction and Public Safety, which was designed to undertake a review of existing policies in the areas of charging, sentencing, and marijuana to ensure consistency with the department's overall strategy on reducing violent crime and with the administration goals and priorities. As part of their recommendations, the task force opposed ramping up enforcement. Instead, it favored the current federal approach set by the Cole Memo. In a letter, Sessions had requested congressional leaders Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, Chuck Schumer, and Nancy Pelosi to remove the amendment, which restricted the ability of the federal government to prosecute state-regulated medical cannabis operations, stating,
"This restriction was unwise, particularly in the midst of an historic drug epidemic and potentially long-term uptick in violent crime."
Sessions also equated cannabis to heroin, at once stating,
"I reject the idea that America will be a better place if marijuana is sold in every corner store. And I am astonished to hear people suggest that we can solve our heroin crisis by legalizing marijuana so people can trade one life-wrecking dependency for another that's only slightly less awful.
In 2018, Sessions rescinded the Cole memo and encouraged active enforcement, though this active enforcement of federal drug policy never materialized. Sessions faced critique from senators, including Kamala Harris.
What got less attention, guys, and also threatens our system of justice, was a memo that the Attorney General issued the following day to federal prosecutors across the country. The United States Department of Justice memo was entitled Department Charging and Sentencing Policy, a subject line that seems pretty tame. However, what it effectively did was to declare the reviving of the war on drugs, the failed war on drugs. And so let's take a look at what Jeff Sessions' outdated and out-of-touch views are doing that are going to be harmful to our country. Sessions has threatened that the United States Department of Justice may renew its focus on marijuana use, even in states like California where it is legal. Well, let me tell you, what California needs, Jeff Sessions, we need support in dealing with transnational criminal organizations, dealing with issues like human trafficking, not going after grandma's medicinal marijuana. Leave her alone.
Turning to another official, Sean Spicer, the first of 4 White House press secretaries for Trump, raised additional concerns about cannabis policy during briefings. Spicer expected greater enforcement on cannabis in individual states. Spicer also noted that there is a big difference between medical and recreational legalization.
Question for the Department of Justice. I do believe that you'll see greater enforcement of it because, again, there's a big difference between the medical use, which Congress has through an appropriations rider in 2014, made very clear what the intent of what their intent was in terms of how the Department of Justice would handle that issue. That's very different than the recreational use, which is something the Department of Justice, I think, will be further looking into.
Last, Spicer made a claim that is rooted in the gateway mythos, the idea that cannabis leads to harder drugs. He stated,
I think that when you see something like the opioid addiction crisis blossoming in so many states around this country, the last thing that we should be doing is encouraging people. There is still a federal law that we need to abide by.
Bob Ferguson, Democrat Attorney General for Washington at the time, who had a track record for advancing progressive drug policy reforms, including cannabis legalization, drug decriminalization, and a suit against Purdue Pharma. He stated that he was deeply disappointed by Spicer's position.
Washington Attorney General Bob Ferguson says he will use every tool at his disposal to defend Washington's voter-approved marijuana marketplace.
I take statements from the White House very seriously when they have the potential to adversely impact the people of the state of Washington, and that is how I interpret this.
Trump expressed his views on cannabis in several instances in a leaked audio recording during a 2018 private donor diner. Trump implied that those who smoke cannabis lose IQ, intelligent quotient, points.
The whole marijuana thing is a good thing?
I think it's a combination. I think it's something that is in the future, and no matter how you look at it. I think it's something that's already so far out that you're not going to stop it. I think you need to be ahead of it, and I think you need to control it and regulate it.
In Colorado, they have more accidents. It does cause an IQ problem.
No,
I think he's right.
No, there is minus.
You lose IQ points.
Yep. But then you take a look at your opioid crisis and then the veterans and the
But
children.
it's actually good for opioids.
Yeah. Yes.
It's
fight against. Yeah.
I'll say this.
Better alternative.
Yeah.
A claim that has been disputed by federal studies, including twin studies. On several occasions, Trump has praised the idea of expanding and streamlining the application of the death penalty to drug dealers.
The only way to solve the drug problem is through toughness. When you catch a drug dealer, you gotta put him away for a long time. When I was in China, and other places, by the way, I said, Mr. President, do you have a drug problem? No, we do not. I said, Big country, 1.4 billion people, right? Not much of a drug problem. I said, what do you attribute that to? Well, the death penalty. So what do you mean no problem? We have a zero tolerance policy. What does that mean? That means if we catch a drug dealer, death penalty. That's why we have a problem, folks. And I don't think we should play games. Now, I never did polling on that. I don't know if that's popular. I don't know if that's unpopular. Probably you'll have some people that say, oh, that's not nice. But these people are killing our kids, and they're killing our families.
He also contrasted his previous support for medical legalization by sending a cease and desist letter to Mississippians for Compassionate Care, an organization that supported ballot Initiative 65, which legalized cannabis for medical purposes, before being overturned by the state Supreme Court for using statements that suggested that he supported medical legalization, such as this previous comment.
For medical purposes, absolutely, it's fine.
The initial 2021 budget proposal included the removal of protections that barred federal resources from being used to prevent states from implementing medical cannabis policies, though this measure was later withdrawn. While the Trump administration exhibited grudging toleration towards cannabis, thank you, Wexler, the change in attitudes was reflected in public discourse by those media outlets accessed by that part of the population that is most likely to use cannabis, young men. Joe Rogan, whose podcast is popular among many, is well known for his support for legalization.
I know people that smoke marijuana and they're high functioning. And I know people that smoke marijuana and they don't get anything done. And I don't know if they're related. Those two things are related. I think people who generally have drive and discipline, marijuana gives them a break. It gives them a nice little, just a little rest stop. And I think that's probably beneficial.
Oh, I didn't see you there. You're listening to the Dazed and Confused podcast, so don't just sit there, dazed. Smash that like button, get subscribed, and scream something dumb in the comments like legalized pigeons.
Absolutely keep a hummingbird as a pet, bro. It's no different than having a parrot or a parakeet. It's a bird, bro.
You really can't? And I'm not saying I agree with it. It's just that bird law in this country, it's not governed by reason.
One well-known episode, viewed more than 7 million times on YouTube, included Steven Crowder, known for his Change My Mind series, along with a litany of discriminatory actions on the basis of race, nationality, sexuality, or gender identification, as well as,
what do you need me to pick up? I'll get it. I'll be back when I'm back.
No, that doesn't work either.
2 hours into the episode, Rogan and Crowder diverged on cannabis policy, including an instance where they bickered on traffic fatalities in legal states.
Since marijuana legalization, highway fatalities in Colorado are at near historic lows.
You haven't bringing up the source that you want to find.
Washington
Bring
Post.
up the study right there. Yeah, Washington Post. Bring up the study that we wrote. We wrote about it on our website.
Look, I don't care about your website, you fuck. Since marijuana legalization, highway fatalities in Colorado
Since you called me a fucking a puss, and you do this with the crazy lady at a comedy club.
Crowder's article stated,
if you want to get high, well, you're a moron. And getting high will make you more of a moron. But fine. After all, things like Coachella wouldn't exist if potheads weren't there to attend. Just don't drive, operate any machinery, or be around children. All things, by the way, a responsible person would have known. But since you're actively dumbing yourself down, on purpose, we have to spell it out for you. Thanks for that.
Later, in 2018, on an episode with more than 68 million views, venture capitalist Elon Musk smoked a joint with Rogan, stating,
So is that a joint? Or is it a cigar?
No.
Okay.
It's marijuana
It's
inside
weed.
of tobacco.
Oh, okay. So it's like pot tobacco
Yeah.
posh.
You never had that?
Yeah, I think I tried one once.
Come on, man. You probably can't because of stockholders, right?
I mean, it's legal, right?
It's totally legal.
Okay.
How does that work? Do people get upset at you if you do certain things? There's tobacco and marijuana in there. That's all it is. The combination of...
This action fanned the flame over Musk's actions because of a growing pattern of incendiary statements, including tweets about taking Tesla private at 420. On the day that the podcast was published, two executives had left Tesla amid a decline in stock price. As a federal contractor via SpaceX, Musk was subjected to random drug tests for a few years. However, reports later revealed that Musk would receive advance notice of these drug tests. He had reportedly consumed various psychedelics and used ketamine, at times daily. States continued to reform laws around cannabis. In 2018, 2 other states had legalized cannabis for adult use purposes. In Vermont, legalization occurred via legislators rather than the typical ballot initiatives, a first in the nation. Michigan became the 10th state in the nation and the first in the Midwest to legalize cannabis for adults. Hours before official commencement of adult use legalization in Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker issued pardons to more than 11,000 individuals convicted of low-level cannabis offenses. In April 2020, the ACLU issued a report entitled A Tale of Two Countries, Racially Targeted Arrests in the Era of Marijuana Reform, which examined nationwide arrests for cannabis offenses from 2010 to 2018. Arrests for cannabis were down overall, though not by much. Much of the decline had been driven by states that had either legalized or decriminalized cannabis. Racial disparities were prevalent, with black individuals 3.64 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than whites, even though both groups use cannabis at similar rates. States that had legalized cannabis had lower rates of disparities than states where cannabis remained illegal. The authors declared,
"This report should be the final nail in the coffin for the inane war on marijuana, and sound yet another abolition knell for this country's 45-year drug prohibition charade."
States continued to legalize cannabis. In Arizona, a margin of 60% of voters passed legislation that legalized the possession and use of 1 ounce or less of cannabis. In New Jersey, by a margin of 67%, voters overwhelmingly legalized cannabis for adult use purposes. 57% of Montana voters passed legislation that legalized cannabis for adult use purposes. In South Dakota, 54% of voters amended the state's constitution to legalize cannabis for adult use purposes. However, in February of 2021, Christina Klinger, circuit court judge, ruled against the measure, a ruling which was later reaffirmed by the state Supreme Court during November 2021, thereby rejecting the will of the people. Near the end of the first Trump term, 2 significant lung-related health illnesses emerged, both of which would shape policy around cannabis and the way individuals administered the drug. By the end of 2019, a lung illness emerged among individuals who vaped, referred to either as vaping-associated lung injury, VALI, or sensationally as the vaping epidemic. This epidemic would result in 2,000 hospitalizations and over 60 deaths. Because the exact source of the contamination was initially unclear, several states restricted both nicotine and cannabis-based vaping products. In California, officials issued an advisory urging people to stop all forms of vaping until a cause was determined. Massachusetts enacted a 4-month ban on the sale of vaping products. The effect of this scare was evident in the regulated cannabis market, which experienced a 15% decrease in revenue from cannabis-based vaping products. Oregon experienced a 60% decrease. Many of the contaminated vape products were later linked to illicit cannabis vape products that had been adulterated with vitamin E acetate, which, when vaped, produces toxic fume. The second major lung illness turned pandemic was COVID-19. In March 2020, local, state, and federal lawmakers issued various public health ordinances. Cannabis businesses in most states were deemed essential, a stark contrast to the public menace of the 1970s. In Denver, Colorado, Mayor Michael Hancock initially issued an order that classified dispensaries and liquor stores as non-essential. Because of public outcry, Hancock released an updated order within 3 hours. In Massachusetts, adult use retail businesses were classified as non-essential though later allowed to open near the end of May of 2020. Around this time, though, the number of new medical patients ballooned because medical businesses were deemed essential. Joseph E. Kennedy, law professor at University of North Carolina, stated,
"The fact that yesterday's vice is considered today's essential service suggests that we got the potential costs and benefits of marijuana used radically wrong."
COVID-19 also had an immense effect on the amount and type of cannabis, as well as the way that cannabis products were being sold. In San Francisco, the week following the stay-at-home order, regulated sales surged 150% compared to that period in the year prior. Reports emerged of dispensaries running out of cannabis. Edibles accounted for a significant portion of the increase in sales. Chris Beals, the CEO of Weedmaps, an online directory of dispensaries, explained,
"When people are working at home or they're around children or family, edibles are just more discreet."
Like other industries, cannabis businesses, both legal and illegal, operated delivery services. Owner of Jack Flash, an illegal delivery operation in New York City, stated,
"Our business doubled. Every day is a Friday. It's just been really nonstop."
A different dealer, identified as Chris, reported that customers no longer hung out at his apartment or chatted long after deliveries. During one transaction, Chris reported a customer handed him a box of disinfectant wipes with cash inside. One issue that regulated businesses face were their ineligibility to participate in the Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, loans. The 2020 election served as a pivotal point in cannabis policy. Joe Biden, the eventual victor, campaigned on the decriminalization and rescheduling of cannabis from Schedule 1 to 3.
As president, I'll work to reform the criminal justice system, improve community policing, decriminalize marijuana, and automatically expunge prior marijuana convictions. I'm Joe Biden, and that's my commitment to you, and I approve this message.
Trump, a known teetotaler, had rarely discussed the topic during the campaign outside of the administrative actions discussed earlier. Kamala Harris, the eventual vice president, stated during an interview that
they say you oppose legalizing weed.
That's not true.
I know.
and look, I joke about it, half joking. Half my family's from Jamaica. Are you kidding me? I believe we need to legalize marijuana. Now, that being said, this is not a but, it is an and. And we need to research, which is one of the reasons we need to legalize it. We need to move it on the schedule so that we can research the impact of weed based on a developing brain. Mm-hmm. If somebody is driving a car, it can be a lethal weapon in the hands of somebody who is impaired. So that needs to be addressed also. But I am absolutely in favor of legalizing marijuana. We've got to do it. We have incarcerated so many, in particular young men and young men of color. So there are a lot of reasons why we need to legalize.
Have you ever smoked?
I have.
Okay. Like in
and
college,
I inhaled. I did inhale. It was a joint.
Hey.
Yeah.
You remember the high?
I do.
So if it was legalized all throughout the country and medicinal, would you do it?
Listen, again? I think that it gives a lot of people joy, and we need more joy.
The platforms of the two major parties diverged even more. The Democrats proposed that
substance use disorders are diseases, not crimes. Democrats believe no one should be in prison solely because they use drugs. Democrats will decriminalize marijuana use and reschedule it through executive action on the federal level. We will support legalization of medical marijuana and believe states should be able to make their own decisions about recreational use. The Justice Department should not launch federal prosecutions of conduct that is legal at the state level. All past criminal convictions for cannabis use should be automatically expunged. And rather than involving the criminal justice system, Democrats support increased use of drug courts, harm reduction interventions, and treatment diversion programs for those struggling with substance use disorders.
In contrast, the Republican National Convention announced that it would not adopt a new party platform and instead would continue with the 2016 platform.
The progress made over the last 3 decades against drug abuse is eroding, whether for cultural reasons or for lack of national leadership. In many jurisdictions, marijuana is virtually legalized despite its illegality under federal law.
In the next episode, we turn to the Biden administration, which could best be described as having a progressive intent. The Biden administration arrived amid a global pandemic, and states were experimenting with every incentive under the sun to get people vaccinated. Some offered cash, some offered beer, and a handful tried something different. Washington State's Joint for Jabs let licensed dispensaries offer complimentary pre-rolls to adults who showed proof of vaccination. Arizona had pop-up clinics at some dispensaries. New York, Michigan, California, and DC also had their own versions of these type of initiatives. Was this the turning point? Maybe not, but it showed that the public conversation had moved. Cannabis was no longer just a criminal justice issue. It was woven into public health initiatives, local business, and state innovation. In October 2022, the White House took its biggest step: pardons for federal simple possession convictions, and a call for governors to do the same at the state level.
It's already legal in many states, and criminal records for marijuana possession have led to needless barriers to employment, to housing, to educational opportunities. And that's before you address the racial disparities around who suffers the consequences. While white and black and brown people use marijuana at similar rates, black and brown people are arrested, prosecuted, and convicted at disproportionately higher rates. So today, I'm taking 3 steps to end this failed approach. First, I'm announcing a pardon for all prior federal offenses for the simple possession of marijuana. There are thousands of people who are convicted for marijuana possession who may be denied employment, housing, or educational opportunities as a result of that conviction. My pardon will remove this burden on them. Second, I'm calling on all governors to do the same for state marijuana possession offenses. Third, the federal government currently classifies marijuana as a Schedule I substance, the same as heroin and LSD, and more serious than fentanyl. It makes no sense.
Advocates cheered, but reminded everyone of the fact that no one was sitting in federal prison solely for cannabis possession, so the immediate effect wasn't releases, though it did provide relief at the margins. A past cannabis conviction creates barriers to jobs, housing, and obtaining certain occupational licenses. The move mattered, but it also created the next domino: rescheduling. President Biden directed the Health and Human Services and the Attorney General to reassess cannabis under the Controlled Substance Act.
So I'm asking the Secretary of Health and Human Services and the Attorney General to initiate a process to review how marijuana is scheduled under federal law. Even as federal and local regulations of marijuana change, important limitations on trafficking, marketing, and underage sales should stay in place. Too many lives have been upended because of our failed approach to marijuana. It's time that we right these wrongs.
HHS conducted an 8-factor analysis which concluded that cannabis should be moved from Schedule I to Schedule III. That recommendation triggered the DEA's formal process, which allowed for public comments, which opened in 2024. The inbox filled with tens of thousands of submissions. A broader study looked at these submissions and found that roughly 70% of individuals were supportive of rescheduling of cannabis. On Capitol Hill, a block of Democratic senators, Cory Booker, Chuck Schumer, Patty Murray, and Kristen Gillibrand, argued in favor of rescheduling to expand research access and address issues in federal tax policy. They cited disparities most listeners know. Black Americans are arrested for possession at higher rates than white Americans, despite similar usage rates. Opposition did exist. 11 Republican attorney generals argued that cannabis still had high abuse potential and, quote, no accepted medical use, warning rescheduling would supercharge the industry that they viewed as unsafe. A bicameral GOP letter raised health concerns and pointed to studies associating cannabis with schizophrenia and a very small subset of young men. However, let's talk about procedure. After public comments closed, DEA Administrator Ann Milgram set a hearing date for December 2024, post-election. But in October, Chief Administrative Law Judge John Mulrooney told DEA to provide more disclosure, citing insufficient information. The timeline moved again. By January 2025, And as I am recording this episode September 14th, 2025, this process has yet to be restarted. If the 1970 Controlled Substance Act is a fortress, rescheduling is trying to lift the portcullis with paperwork. It's slow, contested, and very technical, and yet the consequences, taxes, research access, banking, are anything but technical for people that have to deal with it. Outside of rescheduling, the Biden administration enacted a series of administrative adjustments. For instance, security clearances. The Office of Personnel Management stopped treating any past cannabis use as an automatic disqualifier. Instead, they focused on recent use. The DOJ Inspector General told the DEA to halt random passenger searches at transportation hubs, as they weren't even following their own agency rules. In the final days of the Biden administration, President Biden commuted the sentences for thousands of people convicted of non-violent drug offenses. But Congress was nearly evenly split. Big-ticket reforms stalled. A Schumer-Booker bill proposing to remove cannabis from the CSA didn't move. The White House rejected a proposal to end cannabis testing for new military recruits, citing issues to readiness and safety. Congress kept the rider, blocking Washington, D.C. from launching regulated adult-use cannabis sales. While federal gears moved slowly, states and cities fine-tuned their laws. In 2023, D.C. Superior Court Judge Ebony Scott ruled that a person could sue another individual to force that individual to cease smoking cannabis, even in one's own home. Shepard successfully argued that the odor from Thomas Cackett's use of cannabis in his apartment had seeped through apartment units, amounting to a private nuisance. Cackett had a documented medical condition. Cannabis is not recognized federally as a medical treatment. Judge Scott required Cackett, who denied smoking all day and all night, and declared, quote, "I am not Snoop Dogg," to cease smoking at his address, or 25 feet of Shepard's address. That same year, Mayor Bowser signed legislation to expand the city's medical cannabis program, which allowed individuals to self-certify a medical condition, which basically led to de facto adult use legalization. In California, policymakers continued to implement and refine policies. New policies gave workers protections from termination and disciplinary actions for off-duty cannabis use, and prohibited employers from denying employment solely for cannabis detected in a drug test. Policymakers also passed legislation that legalized Amsterdam-like cannabis cafes, allowing for consumption lounges, which became effective January 2025. Minnesota became the 23rd state to legalize adult use under Governor Tim Walz, part of a larger slate of progressive laws. More than 60,000 cannabis misdemeanors were eligible for expungement. In Texas, cities from Austin to San Marcos moved to decriminalize possession. The state attorney general sued. In Austin, a judge dismissed the challenge. The local measure had passed with roughly 85% of support. At the same time, statewide leaders pushed in the opposite direction, with a proposal floated to ban all retail THC products, including hemp, and they often framed it as a protection for kids. In Illinois, there were two major rulings. In People v. Redmond, the state Supreme Court said that the smell of burnt cannabis alone isn't enough for probable cause, because that odor can linger long after impairment. In Illinois v. Molina, the court said that the smell of fresh cannabis is enough for probable cause to search a vehicle, especially when paired with evidence of improper storage. In Kentucky, medical legalization launched in 2025. And behind the policy was a familiar story: patients seeking fewer pharmaceuticals. One patient described hoping to replace 80 to 90% of her prescriptions with legally obtained medical cannabis. In Washington state, Retailers now have to post signs warning young adults 21 to 25 about risks associated with high-potency products, 35% plus THC. If you zoom out, the pattern is clear. Even without sweeping federal reform, states continue to refine rules around employment, consumption spaces, housing, law enforcement. Why, hello there, I didn't see you. Marx was just teaching me about the labor theory of value and how employers alienate workers from their labor. If you're enjoying this episode of the Dazed and Confused podcast, consider supporting my work through Patreon. It's just $4.20 a month. Otherwise, consider giving this video a like, leaving an interesting comment, and subscribe so you don't miss future videos. In terms of social justice, states took divergent paths on repairing these past harms. Some models I consider are patchwork models. So North Dakota had individuals self-petition for pardons. Pennsylvania had a month-long clemency program, which, helped some, but required residents to actually find the process, find it understandable and clear, and get through. Governor Tom Wolf ultimately issued more than 2,000 pardons, which was more than the total from the prior 15 years. However, sweeping models went much bigger. Oregon issued pardons that affected more than 47,000 people with past possession convictions under 1 ounce. In Massachusetts, they did a mass pardon for misdemeanor cannabis offenses, which led to hundreds of thousands eligible convictions. This was explicitly framed as a relief for job barriers and housing and access to education. In Maryland, Governor Westmore pardoned 175,000 misdemeanor level cannabis possession offenses. In Missouri, courts expunged more than 140,000 cannabis possession convictions. These efforts were not just symbolic. They removed so many legal restrictions that shadowed people's everyday lives. By 2024, most Americans believed that cannabis was less harmful than alcohol and tobacco. Access kept expanding. 79% of Americans lived in a county with at least one dispensary. While California has the most overall dispensaries, Oklahoma led the most in the number per capita. The presidential cycle was whiplash. On the Republican side, Donald Trump dominated the primaries. The party platform mostly sidestepped cannabis. And then from a podium in Florida and on his platform, Truth Social, Trump signaled support for legalizing personal amounts at the state level and called on lawmakers to keep use out of public spaces.
As we legalize it throughout the country, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's awfully hard to have people all over the jails that are in jail right now for something that's legal. So I think, obviously, there's a lot of sentiment to doing that.
As everyone knows, I was and will be again the most respected law and order president in U.S. history. We will take our streets back by being tough and smart on violent and all other types of crime. In Florida, like so many other states that have already given their approval, personal amounts of marijuana will be legalized for adults with Amendment 3. Whether people like it or not, this will happen through the approval of the voters, so it should be done correctly. We need the state legislature to responsibly create laws that prohibit the use of it in public spaces so we do not smell marijuana everywhere we go, like we do in many of the Democrat-run cities. At the same time, someone should not be a criminal in Florida when this is legal in so many other states. We do not need to ruin lives and waste taxpayer dollars arresting adults with personal amounts of it on them, and no one should grieve a loved one because they died from fentanyl-laced marijuana. We will make America safe again.
Elsewhere in the GOP, vice presidential pick J.D. Vance claimed,
but aside from the guns, you see just all kinds of drugs. Bags of marijuana, there's meth, there's pills, there's THC, and of course there's fentanyl. And I asked these sheriffs, I said, well, there's something here that's just out of place. There's a box of candy, like a Nerds candy, Sour Patch candy. And I'm like, what is that? That doesn't belong here. And the sheriff told me that this is actually THC and fentanyl that had been manufactured to look like children's candy so the cartels would make it easier to get it into our country in the first place.
This is just not how it works. Toxicologists and law enforcement guidance don't support that claim. So a couple things. Direct flame, that destroys fentanyl in a joint. Furthermore, when you vape it, if you try to vape the cannabis, those temperatures are too low, incentives are misaligned, and also there's no current federal warnings that have identified a pattern of fentanyl-laced cannabis. This is an example of a bit of a drug panic. On the Democratic side, President Biden won delegates in a largely uncontested primary, but then exited the race after a pretty bad debate performance.
Those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare.
There's no evidence of that at all. And I tell you what, I doubt whether you'll accept it because you're such a whiner. The idea, if you lose again, you accepting anything, you can't stand the loss. Something snapped in you when you lost the last time. The only person on this stage is a convicted felon is the man I'm looking at right now. And the fact of the matter is, what he's telling you is simply not true. The fact is that there was no effort on his part to stop what was going on up in Capitol Hill.
He eventually endorsed Kamala Harris. Harris chose Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, who also legalized cannabis, as her running mate.
Hi, this is Tim.
It's Kamala Harris. Good morning, Governor.
Good morning, Madam Vice President.
Listen, I want you to do this with me. Let's do this together. Would you be my running mate and let's get this thing on the road?
I would be honored, Madam Vice President. The joy that you're bringing back to the country, the enthusiasm that's out there, it'll be a privilege to take this with you across the country.
In the 107 days, Harris publicly supported legalization, saying that people shouldn't be in jail for smoking cannabis.
I just feel strongly people should not be going to jail for smoking weed. And we know historically what that has meant and who has gone to jail.
Mm-hmm.
Second, I just think we have come to a point where we have to understand that we need to legalize it and stop criminalizing this behavior. And so, and I've actually, this is not a new position for me. I have felt for a long time we need to legalize it. So that's where I am on that.
But the 2024 Democratic platform became more conservative in its language on cannabis compared to the 2020 platform. For example, this narrowed language around decriminalization and dropped explicit support for medical legalization. So what happened at the 2024 election? Well, at the ballot box, results were mixed. So in the Dakotas and Florida, we had failed adult use measures. There were wins for Oregon, such as labor protections. Many counties in Kentucky voted to allow cannabis dispensaries in their area. There was also medical legalization in Nebraska. After Trump won the general election, NORML and Marijuana Policy Project circulated a memo that pushed Trump to reschedule cannabis in federal criminalization and restore the Second Amendment rights for cannabis consumers and to stop denying federal housing based on cannabis use as past convictions. There's a lot that happened. Biden issued pardons for many individuals, which would relieve some restrictions that these people may face. He did make a formal push to get cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. So that's probably the largest federal attempt since the CSA got implemented. There were some fine-tuning in the federal policies, such as hiring decisions, as well as pushes for individual states to decriminalize or even pardon individuals. However, we did not get comprehensive federal legalization or even decriminalization, the safe banking law, or i.e. the tax code fix, that was not done, so there's still issues around that. DC still cannot have adult use legalization technically, but de facto they do. The Biden years didn't end prohibition, but they normalized the conversations. The 2024 election reshaped Washington in ways few expected. As Donald Trump returned to the White House, many observers wondered whether federal cannabis policy might finally move. But what followed next was not clarity. It was fragmentation, conflicting voices inside the administration, a Congress without consensus, and states veering in opposite directions, created a national landscape defined less by direction and more by chaos. Today on the podcast, we explore the early actions on cannabis taken by and during the Trump administration second term. Even before Inauguration Day, Trump's cabinet announcements gave early signals that cannabis policy was about to become a tug of war. One of the most surprising figures was Representative Matt Gaetz. Gaetz had a record that broke sharply from Republicans on the issue of cannabis. He openly supported legalization and even posted delist cannabis on social media. But his attorney general nomination crumbled under the weight of many scandals. Later, Gaetz resurfaced again with a photo taken of his laptop on a commercial flight that showed him preparing lobbying material for TrueLeaf, which is one of the nation's largest cannabis companies. While Gaetz fell out of contention for Attorney General, others with strong anti-cannabis views became more apparent. Trump appointed Derek Maltz as the DEA administrator. Maltz had built a public identity centered on strict anti-drug enforcement and routinely blasted state-level reforms online, and he called Oregon's drug decriminalization efforts a total failure and repeatedly linked cannabis to school shootings, emergency room visits, and social decline. Maltz was later replaced by Terrence Cole, who showed little willingness to discuss rescheduling when questioned by Senators Cory Booker and Alex Padilla. At the Department of Health and Human Services, yet another twist. Trump selected Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who, before joining the administration, had voiced support for not only cannabis legalization, but also for psychedelic reform.
What currently illegal drugs would you legalize?
I would decriminalize marijuana on a federal basis and allow the states to regulate it. And I would have a federal tax on it, though, and I would apply that tax to building rehabilitation centers around the country and providing people drug rehabilitation.
What about psychedelics, which have been decriminalized at the state level in Oregon and Colorado?
I would definitely decriminalize psychedelics.
Yet, inside the government, Kennedy has operated under a different tone. During his confirmation hearing, he stated that he would defer to the DEA and DOJ when pressed on scheduling. And in later interviews, Kennedy expressed concerns about high-potency cannabis products.
I'm worried about it. And, I've been in recovery for 42 years. I go to 12-step meetings every day. And so I hear stories all the time of people, of the impacts of marijuana on people and really catastrophic impacts on them. That worry also has to be balanced about, the impacts that we had before. The 25 states now have legalized marijuana, but we had about a third of our prison population that was in jail because of marijuana offenses. That's something we don't want either. We have, because of the legalization of recreational marijuana in 25 states, we have now a capacity to really study it and to compare it to states.
Studies look bad.
Right, and we need to do studies. We need to figure out.
Then there's Russell Vought, returning to the Office of Management and Budget. He took one of the hardest lines in the administration, calling cannabis a gateway drug. on C-SPAN and arguing that protections for medical cannabis should be rolled back.
We have a culture of complacency in this country as to whether it's good to be using drugs. I would say I'm curious, and I can't ask the question, but I'm curious whether you support marijuana usage, the legality of it. Such it's clearly a gateway drug to other more serious drugs. You can't go to a big city without being engulfed with the smell of it, and yet it is a serious problem. And that
Sarah Carter, named director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, came from Fox News, where she focused on immigration and border security. Sabat, of SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, had issued praise for her appointment, hoping she would emphasize prevention and youth harm. During her hearings, she would describe cannabis as relatively bipartisan, but refused to give any specifics on her positioning around rescheduling. And in her written up follow-ups, her positions were very vague, stating that she would comply with federal law and review evidence. Split appointments, mixed messages, and a cabinet that pulled in different directions with not much attention to cannabis. While the administration projected uncertainty, outside groups tried to shape the moment. In July 2025, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, or SAM, launched a wave of anti-cannabis advertising on social media and Fox News. One ad framed cannabis as part of a destabilization plot by foreign cartels.
America faces a choice, and China is watching. Chinese drug cartels are already embedded in America's marijuana trade, profiting while our biggest adversary destabilizes our communities. If activists get their way and reschedule marijuana, it hands China an advantage and harms American public health. Rescheduling marijuana would actually give cartels a tax break. President Trump, don't reschedule marijuana. It's not just domestic policy, it's national security.
Another claimed that legalization undermined Trump's Maha vision for a strong America, warning of psychosis, IQ loss, and threats to youth well-being.
Washington says it's working to make America healthy again, but while they debate red dye and food additives, they're on the verge of normalizing something even worse. High-potency marijuana is triggering addiction, psychosis, and impaired driving, especially in young people. Today's so-called legal marijuana is full of adulterants, pesticides, and GMO ingredients. That's not how we turn around the health epidemic in our country. Make America healthy again by facing the facts on weed. Don't reschedule marijuana.
And another urged viewers to oppose rescheduling outright using AI.
So what do you babies think about rescheduling marijuana?
Move weed to Schedule 3 and big marijuana gets a bedtime story full of tax breaks. No thanks. Teen addiction goes up 25% where it's legal. My brain's still under construction. Don't need any high maintenance. Keep it Schedule 1, please.
I just learned to walk and science says weed means more heart attacks and strokes. I'll pass. I've got enough drama with teething.
At the White House, Trump echoed themes of collapse and disorder. In March 2025, the administration released a policy sheet entitled President Donald J. Trump Works to Make Our Nation's Capital Safe and Beautiful. Among the city's failed policies, the document listed one unexpected item: the decriminalization of cannabis. And in the first budget proposal, the big beautiful bill, the Trump administration attempted to strip long-standing protections for state medical programs, similar to actions done in the first administration. And although Congress later removed this language, the administration had made its position clear. Yet the signals kept shifting. Trump publicly supported Florida State Senator Joe Gruters for RNC chair, even though Gruters favored legalization. In response, Governor Ron DeSantis accused Gruters of siding with mega weed companies and betraying voters. Confusion has become the hallmark of this administration around cannabis. By 2025, many Americans expected to see progress, even on cannabis rescheduling. The Biden administration had begun this process, but inside the Trump administration, the issue had barely moved. In April, a White House official said no action is being considered at this time. In June, athletes like Mike Tyson and Kevin Durant appeared on Fox and Friends urging the administration to move forward.
What is the problem right now? Because it seems it's on its road to being legally nationwide. What are the hurdles you're dealing with right now?
Scheduling from 1 to 3, you have to believe cannabis is in the same category as heroin. How do you categorize it with heroin? Anybody that ever smoked cannabis know there's no comparison. And that's just ridiculous. So we're working on making a Schedule 3 and open up safe banking, because there's over 500,000 people that can't get loans because they're in the cannabis business alone. And that's just so ridiculous. It's such a great income of insurance for the country, and for the country, and I just can't see it. It's just ridiculous.
In July, the DEA confirmed that no steps had been taken. And in August, at a high-dollar fundraiser, Trump had vaguely suggested he might consider reclassification, but still, as of December 2025, no action has been taken. Even those close to Trump's first administration saw little reason for optimism. Sean Spicer declared bluntly that legalization would not happen under Trump. Former HED Secretary Ben Carson went further, publishing an opinion piece linking cannabis to crime and citing research that even the author's caution should not be interpreted as causal. The issue remains unmoved.
So it doesn't take a great deal of intellect to recognize that when you put these substances into communities and you make them easy to obtain, you get a much worse result. Also, people say, well, when I was young, I smoked marijuana. It didn't cause me to have a lot of problems. Recognize that the marijuana of the 60s and 70s was much less potent than the...
Oh, hello there. I didn't see you. I was just teaching Mr. Cookie how to fly. If you're enjoying the Dazed and Confused podcast, you can keep it going for just $4.20 a month on Patreon. It keeps the research flying, and it helps me afford his millet. On Capitol Hill, the landscape wasn't much better. Republicans and Democrats have introduced multiple bills, yet none have advanced meaningfully. There was the Prepare Act, which was a planning for regulatory change, but nothing has come out of that. In September, House Appropriators took a step of voting to prevent the Department of Justice from spending money to reschedule cannabis at all. So of all the things to make sure that the executive can't do, the Congress is trying to make it where the executive can't do anything on cannabis rescheduling. As of now, federal reform appears to be going nowhere. The vacuum at the federal level magnified the importance of state policy. What emerged was a patchwork that diverged sharply across the country. In Florida, a new set of ballot initiative meant to satisfy DeSantis' concerns, such as banning public smoking and banning marketing towards children, has been proposed. Recently, courts decided a case ruling that cannabis odor could no longer be constituted as probable cause for a vehicle search. In Ohio, there was an internal struggle among the Republicans. Lawmakers had repeatedly tried to revise the voter-approved legalization law, but that looked quite differently depending on the camp, so it hit a gridlock. At the same time, Ohio's governor did put a ban on intoxicating hemp products, which was blocked by the courts on the same day. However, there were some new regulations that would eventually pass, adding taxes and potency caps. Texas has underwent some very confusing. Recently, legislators introduced many bills, some aimed at expanding the medical program, others sought to ban all products, including hemp-derived products. And cities also went their own way. Some cities passed reform that would eventually be overturned by state officials that meant to decriminalize cannabis. One of these activist movements, Ground Game Texas, found that cities that maintain decriminalization experience a significant drop in arrests and major savings in enforcement costs. Idaho advanced some of the strictest legislation in the country, including mandatory minimum fines for possession for even small quantities. Policymakers also placed a measure on the 2026 ballot that would give voters the option to give up their ability to vote on the legislation around controlled substances, such as the legalization of cannabis. Meanwhile, other states have gone their own way. Illinois has reported record revenue from legalization. Maryland has recently raised taxes on commercial products. Delaware has opened its first adult use sales. Minnesota has launched retail sales on non-tribal land. Though in Virginia, there remains a bit of a gridlock between the legislature and the governor. Governor keeps vetoing the commercial use bill, so it's legal, but you can't buy it legally. The national map is not trending uniformly towards legalization. It is a fractured landscape still. Legal challenges intensified. One of the most closely watched cases is United States v. Hermani, scheduled for the Supreme Court review in early 2026. This case pertains to whether the federal prohibition on firearm possession by cannabis users is constitutional. And this mirrors a charge filed against Hunter Biden, which President Biden later pardoned. International pressures has added another layer. The recent use of bombs by the U.S. has caused some concern. Colombian President Gustavo Petro urged Trump to reconsider prohibition entirely, suggesting legal trade in cannabis rather than renewed drug war in Latin America. State attorney generals in 39 jurisdictions pushed Congress to ban intoxicating hemp products, reflecting frustration with the regulatory gaps created by the 2018 Farm Bill. And during the 2025 shutdown, one of the most contentious fights centered on hemp products. This bill contains new language on the proposed THC limits, now 0.4 milligrams of THC, which are so strict they would effectively ban much of the current market. And when put to a vote, senators overwhelmingly supported these restrictions. Even federal prosecutors are taking cues. In November 2025, the U.S. Attorney for Wyoming announced plans to increase enforcement on federal lands, signaling another turn towards stricter oversight. Despite the political turbulence, research continued. Well, some of it. And the trends told a story that contrasted sharply with some public rhetoric. National arrest rates for cannabis possession had fallen sharply since 2012. Surveys showed consistent growth in public support for legalization, and major surveys continued tracking adolescent cannabis use, offering a clearer but still nuanced picture of youth behavior during legalization. In 2012, the NSDUH reported that 14% of adolescents aged 12 to 17 had used cannabis in the previous year. By 2023, 11% had reported that. In 2012, Monitoring the Future reported that 36% of 12th grade students had used cannabis in the previous year. By 2023, that figure had dropped to 29%. Monitoring the Future also tracked two key influential factors: perceived risks and availability. In 2012, 73% of 12th grade students reported that regular cannabis use was a great risk. By 2023, only 46% affirmed this position. As for availability, in 2012, 82% of 12th grade students said that cannabis use was either fairly or very easy to obtain. By 2023, 73% had selected this response. In 2013, the YRBS reported that 49% of high school students had used cannabis in their lifetime, whereas 28% reported using it in the previous 30 days. By 2023, 40% of students had reported using cannabis in their lifetime, with 25% reporting it in the previous 30 days. The politics were noisy, but the data was clear. The period following the 2024 election did not bring the clarity many expected. Instead, the United States entered a new phase of cannabis policy making, defined by contradiction. A White House with mixed messages, a Congress unable to advance reform, and states charting different and diverging courses, and a public that largely supports legalization, even as the federal government still stands in opposition. Have a great day.
What the fuck is this thing?
Cross joint.
Yeah.
Never smoked one of those?
You can smoke this?
Hell yeah, man.
No.
This is the future. This is like the apex of the vortex of joint engineering. This is it, man. This is what your grandchildren are gonna be smoking. Future. The future.
That's amazing. Well,